Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? Good? Ooh, it's a lot of echoes. We need some more people to cut down on the echo. So is this the clicker right here, Entree and Dave? Cool. So welcome. Can you hear me, Elizabeth? Okay, so welcome and thanks again for attending our Coming Together speaker series over the winter quarter. Your attendance is greatly appreciated. And your future attendance is also going to be greatly appreciated because the conversations are going to extend more, further than these initial talks in the library lobby. So I want to give a thanks to EM, again, for setting everything up, for facilities, for laying out the chairs, for everybody's bosses that encouraged them to come. Yes. And hopefully more folks will be trickling in. But I wanted to take this opening as an opportunity to kind of review where we're at and what we've done to get to this point. And Robin is here to be the fourth of our speakers this quarter. And on January the 11th, we started with Jossie Ross. And the title of his talk was Saving the World, the Importance of Educational Equity. And as many of you know that we try to extend the conversations and of issues that were brought up throughout the weeks and leading into our next speaker. And we meet every Thursday in A1105 to discuss and unpack the questions that each speaker leaves us with. And Jossie left us with two questions. If equity is not about the willingness to give up something, what is it about? And if the purpose of equity is to find alternative voices, a different consciousness, where are we going to look for other bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing? So that's how we kicked things off on January the 11th, pondering these two questions that led us into our next speaker, which was Robin DiAngelo on January the 25th. And her talk on that day, building off of Jossie's, was Seeing the Water, Whiteness in Daily Life. And the three questions that Robin had us wrestling with throughout those weeks is pick a key identity that is important to you. It could be gender, class, sexual orientation, religion, etc. And reflect how it intersects with your race and sets you up to collude with racism. Okay, so on the first talk, we were talking more broad scale, what does educational equity look like? And Robin really tried to take it to a personal opportunity to look at us, reflect personally. The next question is, how have you sought to save face or look good as a means to protect yourself from examining your own racial identity? And third, what would you want white people to understand about racism? So the first two questions were directed to folks who identify as white on campus, and the third question was really targeted for folks geared towards people who identify as people of color on campus. On February the 11th, Yoshiko Harden came to campus and talked to us about good intentions aren't enough, institutional microaggressions and the ways colleges can address them. So still building. So we went from a very large scale picture to us personally, and now let's take a critical look at our institution by identifying institutional forms of microaggression at the college and what were some of the impacts on students of color. She also asked us to think about if values are prioritized to the point of execution, what does the college really value? And she spoke about how she really valued exercise and she keeps her gym bag in her trunk every day, but she had only been to the gym twice in 2 months. So it's like, we value exercise, we value diversity, but how well do we prioritize it to the point of execution? And the last question is, what do you need from college administration leadership to move equity work forward? So we went very broad scale, personal, institutional. And there's been some topics and some things that brought up that may have some folks feeling a little bit unsure of the direction of where we're going. And so our fourth speaker is Robin DiAngelo today, and she'll be talking about the topic of white fragility. But before we have Robin come up, I always like to allow students to center their voice. And so we're gonna have a student come up, a student that has been attending the speaker series over the last 2 months, somebody who has deep roots at Evergreen, whose father is an alumnus, whose sister is an alumnus, somebody who came to Evergreen because it promised something that he dreamt about. So I would like to introduce Micah Cawthorn John Micah Cawthorn to read his piece, This Place.
Good afternoon. Make sure this is right. Okay. This work is entitled This Place. I always caught myself thinking, you need space. So find a place for your thoughts to roam, an ideal place. So when I shift from flow to flow, please know that this kid thought he knew what he was getting into, but no. Every time I step outside from my dorm room, I still have to listen to music that reassures my blackness. Because the other day, my pride was hurt when I overheard one white classmate say to the other, "We have Monday off." I don't know why, but it's great. I chuckled, because in this event, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And in response to my reaction, another white classmate gave me a look of indignation, and with such aggravation, made the decision to voice their opinion. Why are you making fun of him? He's a nice guy, come on, man. My overly analytical mind put me in a bind of paralysis, like, is this a joke? Should I entertain this? I sat up in my chair, met them eye to eye, and said, I can either laugh at this, about why he doesn't know the significance, or I can be mad. Which would you prefer? Son of an alumnus, brother of an alumna, I have a deep appreciation for Evergreen and the people it brings. So don't have my sentiments blurred. But when a classmate says that a reading on social justice was rudimentary because he couldn't see the validity in the observations of white privilege, I just think, Evergreen, let's have those audacious conversations for those who've been taught the wrong history. And I concede, even I fall under that category. Yet I'm trying to find the truth, but I feel like my college is not helping me look. Evergreen is doing better than most predominantly white institutions. But when I open a new tab on my computer screen, I see on the home page, Evergreen, a progressive, public, liberal arts school. I just think this place is ideal, but not the place I've come to know. Thank you. Now I have the honor of introducing keynote speaker Robin DiAngelo. One of her works, What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy, has been met with great praise throughout Evergreen and beyond. It came to my attention in taking Dr. Tom Wilmerdorf's fall class, The African American Experience, where in it we evaluated why this nation is in no way a post-racial society. DiAngelo's work supported our discussions of racial inequity and racial inequality by meticulously unwrapping the dynamics that favor a few on the basis of race, a social construct. Her experience as a diversity trainer enabled her to see the world objectively, through racial perspectives outside of her own. In parting, I'd like to leave you with a piece from What Does It Mean to Be White? DiAngelo says, I was not looking out through a pair of objective eyes. I was looking through a pair of white eyes. This ignorance was not benign or neutral. It had profound implications in my sense of identity and the way I related to people of color. Please join me in welcoming Robin DiAngelo to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This is my second time here with the honor to speak to you, and I know some people were here before when I came and some weren't, and some of you might have watched the video. So I'll do a little bit of review so that we can then go deeper. So when I was here last time, I talked about seeing the water, right? The question that drives my work is, what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separate and unequal by race? How do we pull off these narratives, even as we live and the practice of our lives would belie the claims that we make? So I want to start by positioning myself. I think it's always key. I am white, in case you didn't notice. And as the quote was read there, I'm really clear that I have a white frame of reference, a white worldview. I move through the world with a white experience, and that's the position that I speak to you from. And in many ways, I'm primarily speaking to white folks because we are socialized, and I will kind of unpack this today in my talk, into a kind of aggressive ignorance, aggressive denial of what it means to be white. And so since the majority of my audiences are other white people, that's who I'm talking to. And so I want to acknowledge a few key things. All of the mentors of color, the brilliant, patient mentors of color that didn't give up on me, and that helped me get to where I can articulate what I can today. I want to acknowledge that people of color have been saying what I'm going to say today for decades, if not hundreds of years, but they're not heard in the same way. And so even as I commit my life to trying to interrupt racism, I am also necessarily reinforcing it. And that's Audre Lorde's master's tools dilemma, right? It's a both end, and I'm very clear about that. And I've kind of come to terms with, yes, I'm reinforcing the authority of the white voice, the knowledge of a white perspective, the accolades I often get for making this accessible to white people. In doing that, right, I'm reinforcing white centrality. And if my voice can be heard, I'm going to use it to speak truth to power, essentially. So I do want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that people of color have a knowledge on whiteness that I will never have. And I always invite folks of color in the audiences to challenge me or hold me accountable, and if they choose to do that. And I also very deliberately don't invite white people to do that. So that's my first interruption kind of the white norm. What I invite us to do is to reach for humility in the face of our opinions, which everybody has. Nobody gets through this point in life without having opinions on this topic. But if we haven't devoted ongoing, sustained study and practice on arguably the most complex and nuanced perennial dilemma since the founding of our country, our perspectives and opinions are necessarily limited. So to reach for humility and to grapple rather than reject or decide, do I agree or do I disagree, right? It's a particular way of thinking about race, and I think that it enables us to ask questions that are different than the dominant frame allows us to ask. So my example, and I don't know if I used this last time, was Marxist theory. How many of you here have ever had a class on Marxist theory? I'm at Evergreen. Look at them, all the hands. Usually, I don't know, only 2 or 3 hands go up, and people kind of giggle. Okay, so you had the class on Marxist theory. Did you pass? Okay, most of you passed. All right. So did you become Marxists? Okay. Were you required to become Marxists? No. Right? You might have at the end of that course, but it would not be expected that you become a Marxist, right? What would be expected is that you grapple with Marxist theory, gain some degree of mastery, and probably your final project would be apply a Marxist analysis to this set of problems. What kind of questions would we ask from a Marxist frame? Those are going to be different from the kinds of questions we might ask from a capitalist frame. And the kind of questions we ask about race and racism from an anti-racist frame are very different than the kinds of questions we would ask from a dominant or mainstream frame. For example, dominant frame is, was that racism? And usually there's a vigorous denial, right? A pros and a con, was that racism? From an anti-racist frame, the question is not was it, the question is how was it? It's always at play. It's in every situation, every dynamic. You can never really say regardless of race, or race had nothing to do with it, right? That's not really possible to remove it. And I think we understand this around gender, that you can never take gender out of an interaction. I might not know how gender's at play, but if I have a conflict with somebody, gender's in there. It's in there in the way that I've been socialized to relate to conflict, to the kinds of emotions I've been socialized to display as someone who is cisgendered, raised female, right? And it's the same with race. In this society, with the deep socialization we have, we can never remove race from the equation. So I think the person who introduced me asked me my gender pronouns, which I really appreciated, and this is a learning edge for me, right? And it's also, I think, shows how our learning is never finished because our understandings evolve over time, right? And for me, this is a really big learning curve, how to talk about race, class, and gender without reinscribing kind of cis-normative categories, right? And so it's more and more normal to be in a meeting and say what your gender pronouns are. Is this common for you all in your classes, right? Okay, is it common for you to say what your racial identity is? No. And see, I would really like to see that. I think if you're going to have a meeting, it's particularly one in which decisions are being made that affect people's lives, I would love if we went around first and we each said our racial identity, to just kind of put it front and center. Remember, you're speaking and engaging most particularly as a white person on this topic. And so the decisions that you make and the perspectives that you're going to have are going to be informed by that. I think that would be a really, really powerful. Okay, So racism is a form of systematic oppression. I'm going to go really quickly because my sense is most people understand that, again, the dominant frame is that racism is individual conscious dislike. In other words, some individuals have racism and some don't. And those that do know that they don't like people of color. And that's what it's all about. And that, of course, it drops out the power of implicit bias. It drops out the difference between intent and impact, and it absolutely drops out structural, institutionalized inequality or racism, right? So an anti-racist frame understands racism as a system. While individual players partake in it, it's not dependent on individual players, right? It's embedded in the fabric of the society, in all the institutions, the norms, the practices, the policies, the way that history is told, and it functions to ensure an unequal distribution of basically everything between people of color as a whole and white people as a whole. And just a quick disclaimer, these are socially constructed categories, and I'm collapsing a whole bunch of really important nuance under that category, people of color, but in a really short period of time, I will often just talk about the big binary I think most of us recognize in the way that society is set up, right? Okay. So let me use an example. I think when I was here before, I used the example of when women got the right to vote. Did I use that one? Those of you that were here, to show the difference between personal prejudice, which everybody has, and actual control, legal authority, and institutional control, right? So only men could grant women the right to vote. They couldn't give it to themselves. They couldn't take men's right to vote away. They could certainly have attitudes towards men, but they didn't control the institutions. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and discrimination and systematic control, right, or dominance. So when we use the terms racism, sexism, any of the ism words, we're acknowledging power, right? Legal authority and institutional power and control. And so we wouldn't say everybody's racist. Everybody's prejudiced. Everybody participates in discrimination based on that prejudice, but only the dominant group would I use the term ist, racist, sexist, right? So let me give you another example that I didn't use last time, I don't think. Did I use Jackie Robinson? All right, so we all know the Jackie Robinson story, right? What's he famous for? Yes, and what did he do? He broke the color line, right? I mean, that's the narrative. Those are the exact phrase. He broke the color line. And so what does that do? What does that discourse do, right? Well, he was really special. He was exceptional. He did it. He had what it took. I always get this image of like this somebody running and there's this yellow ticker tape and he just finally busts through it, you know, yeah, right? So think about what that narrative does. It's the narrative that we're given, but it makes really about, I mean, at a deeper level, finally one of them had what it took, right? Was good enough, tried hard enough, worked hard enough, and was able to compete with us, if you will. But what if the narrative went like this? Jackie Robinson, the first black man whites allowed to play baseball. That is the story, right? That is what happened. Jackie Robinson could not play if we did not allow him. We made the policies and the practices that denied him, and then we changed them to include him. It wasn't up to him. And I'm sure there were many, many, many other people before him that were, you know, phenomenally talented, right? If he just walked out on that field, the police would remove him. Right? It's who has that institutional control. That's the difference. So to compare Jackie Robinson's attitudes towards white people, which he understandably may have, and I think he does actually, I've read some interviews, to compare that to white folks' attitude towards him is an unfair comparison because the impact is so much more profound. And that's why we reserve some language to acknowledge that difference. And right now, that language are the ism words for the most part. Okay, and I use this image of the bird cage. It's Marilyn Frye's metaphor that oppression is like a bird cage. You know, we tend to take a micro or myopic view of the bird in a cage, right, in dominant society. And so if you walk up to the cage and put your face up against it, up against the bars, you're really not going to see the cage at all anymore. You're going to get just a very peripheral view of maybe a little bit on the side, and you're looking at the bird wondering what the problem is, right? The little door's open. Why doesn't the bird just fly away, right? Why don't they just do this? But if you step back and you begin to take a macro view, and you'll begin to see these wires and these wires and these wires, and you begin to see the interlocking network of dynamics and policies and practices that, while they don't make it impossible for that bird to fly away, make it highly unlikely. Certainly we can predict that it probably won't, or at least it will have to overcome many, many more barriers than a bird that's not in the cage, right? So again, micro versus a macro understanding. So let's look at what some of those bars are. Our institutions, our ideology, our culture, microaggressions, history, threats of violence, isolation, internalized oppression, rewards for conformity, invisibility, the burden of representation, unacknowledged historical trauma, to name a few. And I think the quote that was up here before I got up speaks to that constant threat of violence, right? That psychic weight of that. Okay, so we just want to be really clear about the difference between individual prejudice and systemic oppression. So I also showed this, and this is my metaphor, because for a living I, for the most part, talk to primarily white groups about racism, and I'll just go for it. If we're using an institutional power relation framework to understand the difference between personal prejudice, which everybody has, and institutional oppression, and we're using words like racism, sexism, ableism, classism to speak to this particular type and form that it's taking, only the dominant group can be racist, sexist, classist. Only white people can be racist. Okay, and everybody just breathe, okay? And if that really, really stirs you up, great. Use it as a door in to get some insight into how you're thinking about this and what your investment is in this narrative that they're just as such and such as we are, right? Again, everybody has prejudice, but only the dominant group can wield legal authority and institutional control behind their prejudice, which transforms it, okay? So I hear these narratives day in and day out as I do this work. And so the image I got was like a dock or a pier, because it signifies for me the superficial or surface nature of these narratives. So let's look at them. I was taught to treat everyone the same. I see people as individuals. You all heard these narratives? Okay. Do you know that you actually cannot be taught to treat everyone the same? Okay. You can be told to do that. You cannot teach human beings to treat everyone the same. So that's not actually possible. And the little bubble over my head when someone says this is, oh, doesn't understand socialization. Okay. And then usually it's followed by, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. Okay, that's another one. I always like to take opportunity to ask people, please drop that from your vocabulary and never use that again. Because people don't come in those colors. It's actually really demeaning to refer to people in that way. Racism's real. If we're going to have a conversation, let's do it in a real way. It's also probably not a good idea to begin any sensitive discussion with, I don't care. All right. Racism in the past doesn't have any meaning. Everyone struggles. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. Have you ever heard those used interchangeably? Because it doesn't really matter what goes in front. We always have to position ourselves as not racist, and I'll talk about why in a moment. So-and-so just happened to be black, or whatever other race that you're referring to, but what follows this is, but race had nothing to do with the interaction. These are colorblind narratives, and I'm going to assume that most people in this group understand that colorblind narratives are not useful. Right? What they do is deny the reality. We don't live in a world where color doesn't matter or race doesn't matter. And so to pretend that it doesn't matter is deeply discounting of that reality, right? I have to get that one in there. I was in the military. It's another one I often hear but no institution is free of racism. Well, I don't know people that use color. I mean, I meet people with colorblind, but the people I hang out with don't use colorblind. We've got a hipper set, which I think might be more familiar in a context like this. So let's look at what this kind of Seattleite, evergreen, vegetarian types say. All right. I work in a very diverse environment. I have people of color in my family. This one's real popular in Seattle. I live in the most diverse zip code in the United States. Okay. So how many of you in a conversation with a white person about racism have heard some version of these? Okay, so look at like a lot of people. They're really popular, right? And so it's actually really useful to do some discourse analysis and figure out what is the person doing and saying, because then you can speak to it. So they're giving you evidence, right? This is their evidence. So what is it their evidence of? If this is what I say to you when the subject of racism comes up, what am I trying to tell you? This is actually a really easy question. I'm not racist, okay? And so if that's my evidence that I'm not racist, how do I define racism? What does it mean to me that I would need to tell you that as a proof that I don't have it? So it's like a conscious, explicit dislike, wouldn't be able to tolerate, apparently, working a few cubicles away from a person of color. Or another popular one is, do I have it coming up? I used to live in New York. That's why I'm not racist. All right, so that being by them, being around people of color, these things make us not racist, right? So it's conscious dislike, and this is what this person is trying to tell you. So again, not understanding the power of implicit bias, not understanding the current of the water, right, and all of the ways that it gets reproduced regardless of whether you personally are aware of how you feel or interact with people of color. This idea that the new generation, that this is just an issue with older people is really popular also. By every measure, racial disparity has continued unabated in our country. Our schools are almost to a pre-Brown versus Board of Education degree of segregation. Our teaching force is getting whiter. School to prison pipeline. By every measure across every institution, racial disparity is acute and continues on. So clearly this idea that the younger generation is more open it's an adaptation, right? All of these narratives, I would say, are younger narratives, right? These are not my father's narratives. Right? Neither of these are my father's narratives. These are my students' narratives. Okay? So we have new narratives, but they still function to obscure and protect. Right? I already know all this. I was in the Peace Corps, or I marched in the 60s, or I took a class. This idea that we can just be done. We could just figure it out and then be done and never really have to be challenged or continue to engage. Good schools, good neighborhood narratives are another form of kind of new racism. And of course, if the person is talking to someone who's kind of anti-racist in a conscious way, they'll tend to downplay their choice of neighborhood and schools. Right? So if they're talking to me, they'll often say, yeah, we feel real bad about it, but we had to, right, for the schools. If they're talking maybe to their family, it's like, oh, it's a great school. It's in this neighborhood, right? Do you know what I'm talking about, or how we emphasize the cultural capital around that? Okay. So in thinking about how we pull off these narratives, we have to go under the surface of that pier or that dock and figure out what is propping that up, right? And I think probably the number one support for this is this idea that to be a good person and to be complicit with racism is mutually exclusive, right? It's not possible. And so what most white people hear when you try to connect us to it is, you just said I was immoral. That is a deep moral. Well, let me just ask you, how often have you ever had the experience of trying to talk to a white person about racism and noticed any defensiveness? Okay, right? Well, what the defensiveness is, you just said I was not a good person, right? And so post-civil rights, it's a really brilliant adaptation because it looks really positive, right? Racism's now bad. And that's certainly better than when it was completely acceptable and legitimate to openly profess it, right? But again, it functions to block off and deflect the absolutely essential self-examination that's required of us across our lifespans, ongoing, right? So we'll fill this in. We know our racist is ignorant and bigoted and prejudiced, mean-spirited, old, Southern, drives a pickup truck, because we got to get a little classism in there. Not racist, or educated and progressive and open-minded, well-intended, young, Northern. Movies reinforce this all the time, right? There's the good whites and the bad whites. Usually when, I like to say to white people, if there's a movie about race, a Hollywood movie about race, and you love it, it should just be a red flag. You should just come out of there going, oh my God, I love that movie, uh-oh. Something, I need to think a little more deeply. Because usually what it's doing is reinforcing this idea of ourselves as good and clearly against the bad whites that are in that movie. There's also often a sense of a kind of a heartwarming sense of love for innocent, victim-like people of color. Think The Blind Side. I got a whole chapter on that in my book. Okay. So I can't emphasize this enough. This is not useful. Just get rid of it. It is not possible to avoid being socialized into a racist worldview if you're white. It's not possible. It's coming at us 24/7. The only way to resist it is to be able to see it and think it through. So to deny it is not going to help you, right? So just think about it as, it's inevitable. I want to see it so I don't step in it. Thank you, bring it on, let me keep thinking, let me keep noticing. It's such a different, it's so simple, but it's so profoundly different than the way it's set up now, which is that you just gave me a deep personal insult that I'm gonna have to fight. Right? So I think that the key props or supports that keep racism unabated today are colorblindness or celebrate diversity narratives. Those are the two versions of the doc that I showed you. This good-bad binary is incredibly effective at holding it in place. Individualism, this emphasis on ourselves as individuals and that we can be exempt from all of this conditioning and socialization. Even as I do these talks, oftentimes people get their backs up just in the fact that I'm generalizing, and that's like a very sacred ideology, right? You can't generalize. Well, actually, as a sociologist, I can. There are patterns that we can look at and identify and grapple with, right? Universalism is the opposite. Like individualism is why can't we all be different, and you need to see me as different. And universalism is why can't we all be the same? It's you focusing on difference that's making the problem. Also notice that white people get to be both individuals. This is a privilege of whiteness, and we also get to be the universal human representing all other humans, right? So those are privileges that are not allowed or granted to everybody. Internalized superiority, there's no way you can miss that. And investment in the racial order. Look, from the time I opened my eyes, I was told, even where I could open my eyes, who owned that hospital, who delivered me, who cleaned that room at night. I was born into a racial hierarchy. And there's really never been a space outside of it, and it feels good to be told you're better. Now, that is in deep conflict with my values, but it's also really seductive. And this is why it takes relentless care and focus and engagement, right? So I have investments in this I don't even know I have, and I gotta watch myself, because there's like lots of tricky ways that even as I think I'm challenging it, I might actually be reinforcing it, right? So can't be complacent. And then segregation. I think segregation, I don't know which one is more powerful, but the good-bad binary and segregation are probably, for me, the most profound. This preference for segregation and all the ways that segregation sets us up to not understand the realities of people of color, not value their experiences, and yet get to be in the position to decide whether their experiences are legitimate. So there's three key questions I want folks to just think about for a moment. Think about how racially diverse your neighborhood was growing up, or how racially diverse it is now. Think about, it's probably the most powerful to think about in terms of when you were a child, right, when you grew up, and what messages do we get? What maybe our parents didn't tell us everybody was equal. Some of our parents did, some of ours didn't, right? But our schools certainly did. The posters with all the hands of the different colors holding each other, all of that told us that, everybody was equal and valuable, and yet we're living separate from one another. And you have to make sense of this. The practice of our lives is so much more powerful than any words that we're told. So why do we live apart? Where are they? Where are people of color? What messages was I given about their spaces? And across this nation, the vast majority of white people's answers to these questions are, I grew up in segregation. Well, we don't tend to call it that. We say I grew up in a good neighborhood or a sheltered neighborhood or maybe a white neighborhood, right? Keep noticing the power of words like good and sheltered and what they're doing, right, discursively. But I think we should call them what they are, segregation, right? That we choose and that we often prefer. I would say we do prefer, okay? And the messages we've been given is to steer clear of neighborhoods associated with certain groups of color, right? Sketchy neighborhoods, right? Be careful, right? Okay. Now think about your teachers. Think about when was the first time you had a teacher of the same race as you are, and how often did that happen? And when's the first time you had a teacher of a different race, and how often did that happen? And why might that matter? And again, if you're like the vast majority of people, and I would say white people across this nation, your answer is, actually this one, everybody, your answer is, you pretty much only ever had white teachers. So if you're white, you were relentlessly reflected at the front of the room, and you could get through graduate school without having a teacher of color, right? Or maybe one, maybe two. And if you're a person of color, rarely, if ever, did you see yourself reflected at the front of the room. So that teaching force, which is upwards of 93% white across the nation, answers the questions just like most other white people, right? Grew up in segregation, only had white teachers. So where do we get our information about people of color? Well, I would say really problematic sources. Not authentic, sustained relationships, that's for sure, right? But movies and television and music and jokes and omissions. Right? And yet these teachers are now in the position to decide who's smart, who belongs where, who should be punished for what. And we see this empirically in the outcomes of tracking, special ed referrals, punishment, expulsion, the school-to-prison pipeline, right? And again, individually, I think teachers, white teachers, mean well, but collectively, this implicit bias is coming through in really profound ways. And so I have a friend who puts it like this, and since it gives me the chills when she does it, so I'll do it for us. Pretty much all of us have been taught by white people, who've 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 been taught by white people, taught by white people, using textbooks written for, about white people. All right, so what I'm pushing on here is to get how thoroughly socialized into whiteness we are, the white worldview, and that it's so beyond whether you do or don't tell jokes, or you do or don't have a friend or a partner of color, right? It's saturated in the fabric of our society, right? And that's I think the level at which it has to be addressed. That's another lifelong one, but I want to show you an image now that I think captures that second question. I showed this image last time, but for those who didn't see it, this is the college champion Jeopardy playoffs. So those are our best and our brightest, certified as highly educated by our institutions of higher learning. They're real smart kids. I mean, those are the Jeopardy champions. And that's the board at the end of the grand champion round, and as we can see, there's one category not one of them touched, so clearly that was the hardest category, and they didn't want to lose. So I don't know what it would be for you. For me, it would be astrophysics. It could actually be algebra, and I wouldn't touch it. All right? Just think about what it could be for you that you're like, I'm not even going to do it. I haven't really figured out how to express how deep this is in terms of how far we're moving away from ever understanding racism and institutional racism, and how we all got to where we are, and the history, all of our history. Charles Wright Mills is a sociologist who has an award-winning book called The Racial Contract. And he says that the racial contract is the social contract that underwrites all others and has for the last 500 years. It's did I say white supremacy is the racial contract? Yeah, he says white supremacy is the social contract that underwrites all other. And it's the only one that we don't study. So we study capitalism, democracy, fascism, communism, Marxism. We don't study white supremacy. Just think about that. Think about how it could be possible that we don't study white supremacy in this country, that we don't know this history, right? And we're only going to move further away from it, right? Okay, so all of this sets up patterns, right? We have a preference for racial segregation and a lack of a sense of loss about that segregation, right? No one who loved me or guided me or taught me or mentored me ever conveyed to me that I'd lost anything by living a segregated life. No one suggested that that white neighborhood and those white school teachers called good schools and good neighborhoods. Just think about that. Think about that. I know you've talked about microaggressions, right? That slap every time we call a segregated neighborhood and school good, right? And that there's no sense of loss. I think that's probably the most profound message that I was given growing up by those who loved me, that there's no inherent value in the experiences or perspectives or relationships with people of color. And then think about how that's going to shape how I come to the table as an adult who gets to make decisions that impact other people's lives, right? We lack an understanding of what racism is. We see ourselves as individuals outside of all of this socialization. We don't understand that we bring our history with us. History matters. So often you hear a white person say something like, well, how dare you assume I would be racist? You don't know me. And of course, my question, well, I would think you would be smart not to assume that I wasn't, right? How about I earn that? How about I demonstrate that, right? There's a history of harm between our groups. And it's a function of privilege or entitlement to be expected to be granted the benefit of the doubt without having to earn that in this context, right? Assuming everyone is having or can have our experience, why don't you just work hard like I did, right? Lack of racial humility, unwillingness to listen. Have you guys seen any of these patterns? Okay. Lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color. Inability to sustain long-term relationships. If you are engaged in authentic cross-racial relationships, racism will come up. And if it isn't coming up, it's probably not as close a relationship as you think it is. And often what happens is when it gets hard around race, white people just end the relationship and then say the problem is you're a difficult person, rather than I wasn't willing to build my capacity to have those difficult conversations or to get that feedback. Believing that we can be exempt from racial socialization just because we want to, or we took a class, or because we experienced another form of oppression, or traveled abroad, or whatever, right? Wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions. Well, you're not telling us what to do, right? I believe that if you truly integrate a racial, kind of an anti-racist frame into everything you see, in the way that you see it, you don't necessarily need to be told what to do, right? It's just part of how you come to the table, although there are many, many resources out there, right? Confusing not agreeing with not understanding. What I mean by that is insisting that the problem was you misunderstood me, rather than, no, I understood you perfectly. I even understand what you meant. What you don't get is how what you meant was racist. That like kind of, which also goes with this one, is until you can explain it to me so that I understand it, I'm not going to validate it. And so you see how much of this is reaching for humility. In the face of our socialization, I may actually never understand this. And my validating it is not contingent on my agreeing or understanding it. Needing to maintain white solidarity, save face, look good, so all the ways that we try to look down, I mean not down, I mean like down, cool. White solidarity, the tacit or unspoken agreement among whites that we'll keep each other comfortable and not call each other out on our racism. right? That will privilege minimizing conflict over being in our integrity, right? This is the Uncle Bob says that thing at the dinner table, and 5 people cringe, but nobody says anything because they don't want to, make Uncle Bob uncomfortable, right? So that's white solidarity, because what does it do? Of course, it functions to protect all of our privilege and positions. Guilt. Some guilt is just par for the course, actually. I mean, it's in there when you really look at this. But you always have to ask yourself, how is this functioning? And if it's functioning to mobilize you or to excuse inaction or to be the reason why you won't engage because somebody's trying to make you feel guilty or any of those kinds of things, then you've got to push through it, right? Because then it's just an indulgence. Defensiveness. And what else do I have on here? Focus on intentions over impact, and I think I have one more. Yes, playing it safe and not taking risks or engaging, right? I'm just not going to show myself. I'm not going to take a risk. And I understand not wanting to accidentally say the wrong thing and hurt somebody. The problem is if we don't take a risk, we're never going to know that what we're thinking is problematic, right? So what you end up doing is protecting our blind spots. So there's a way to take risks with humility, right? Like, I'm not sure if the way I'm thinking about this is off, and let me know if it is, but here's what's coming up for me right now. Can you help me with that? That's a really inviting way, as opposed to either I'm not going to say anything or I'm just going to put it out like a claim that makes you have to kind of debate it, right? So white fragility is my term for this dynamic that I've witnessed over and over, which is essentially the inability to handle challenges to our worldview. So we live in a society that keeps us insulated, right? Racially insulated. I'm rarely ever in the minority racially. I can easily avoid that. I've been warned all my life to avoid that, right? I could probably do it and then have that be a really interesting cultural experience, right? But, very controlled ways I can consume some of that. But mostly I've been told to avoid it. So there's this incredibly insular, I had a graduate degree and was a full adult before I ever had my racial worldview challenged in any sustained way by any significant number of people of color. And part of being white is I could get that far in life and never had my worldview challenged. I couldn't even tell you I had a racial worldview, right? So we live in this incredibly insular environment. We have a lot of implicit bias that we don't necessarily want to acknowledge, right? Some of it is a kind of oblivion. I think it's an aggressive oblivion, right? We have to work hard to push this out because it's pretty evident all around us. So there's some obliviousness. There's also some contempt. If my understandings of people of color come from media, I got some negative ideas. How could I not, right? I have some resentments, right? Because of all of the messages, right? So you challenge my worldview, and a lot of that comes out, right? And it throws us off our racial equilibrium, because our racial equilibrium is comfort, right? Comfort, centrality, right? Normalcy, authority, getting to speak for everybody, right? And these are rarely challenged. So when they are, it's like a shock to the system. And we need the challenge to stop. And so we engage in behaviors that stop the challenge, right? And again, this doesn't necessarily have to be conscious, but it just is so predictable, right, that I think that's what's going on. So what are some of the things that trigger white fragility? Well, suggesting that a white person's viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference, right? Well, that's just a challenge to objectivity. And objectivity is one of the things white folks are granted, right? We're objective, you play the race card, right? People of color talking directly about racism. This is a challenge to white denial, white taboos about talking about race. We don't like that. This is why people of color in organizations often certainly rise faster if they keep white people comfortable, and tend to be penalized if they challenge our realities, right? People of color naming white racism, which is a challenge to white expectations and our sense of entitlement to be comfortable, right? I'm always comfortable and you just made me uncomfortable, so something's wrong, right? People of color not being willing to tell their stories or answer questions about their racial experience, which is a challenge to expectations that people of color will serve us and do our work for us. I actually see it as a form of colonialism, right? You do all the hard work. And then you like make yourself vulnerable, right? And then offer me that work. And I will examine it. I will examine the fruits of your labor, and then I will decide which ones I value and which ones I don't, without ever taking risks on my part, right? So you see this, what does this dynamic look like in the classroom? White people take up all the space until the topic's race, and then we let people of color take all the risks, right? Or we just come up to people and want to kind of interrogate them and ask them their opinions, or tell me what you think of this, or, you don't agree with that, do you? Or all those ways that we put them on the spot, but we're not meeting them halfway with that. I'll tell you a story, actually. I have a friend she's a black woman, and she was involved in this counseling organization. She was taking a class. She was the only person of color in the class. And one day the instructor said to her, I want to address racism next week, so will you teach that class? So she called me up, and she was agonizing, because part of her was like, oh my God, do they need this? Part of me wants to explain to them. And the other part is just, oh my God, I'm the only person of color in that class, and making myself vulnerable in front of them, and they could negate or argue or discount. So she spent hours kind of torn up about what to do. And then she said, I will do it if you'll come with me, and you speak to the white people about what it means to be white, right? So we did it, and we're looking out over this room of white people, and one of the class members says, I'm so glad this organization is finally addressing this topic, because I have wanted this to be addressed, right? And I just got this sense of I watched my friend Deborah, just the days of agony she went through, thinking about this, deciding to do it, preparing to do it, right? The gut-wrenching, how many sessions I gave her with, how emotional it was for her. And then to have somebody that just sat there and received it, and then actually said, I've been waiting for the organization to bring this to us. Can you see, that's when I got this kind of colonial sense about that dynamic. And this one is important to me because when I first got my worldview challenged by people of color, this is what we were fighting over. And I was just going back and forth well, if you don't tell me, how am I supposed to know? Anybody ever heard that? If they don't tell us, how are we supposed to know? I was really caught up on that. And aside from what it's doing that I just laid out, it's also reinforcing this idea of my racial innocence. I'm racially innocent. You are the holder of racial knowledge. And I actually don't think white people are racially innocent at all. Right? We have great expertise on what it means to be socialized into oppression and a racist worldview while denying that that's happening, right? There's lots of things we could address. A fellow white person not agreeing with you or your perspective, so that's a challenge to white solidarity. Receiving feedback that your behavior had a racist impact, that's a challenge to white liberalism. Suggesting that group membership is significant, that's a challenge to individualism. Acknowledging that access is unequal between racial groups, that's a challenge to meritocracy. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership, that's a challenge to white authority. You all know that your professors of color get lower evaluations, probably, right? Because whether you're conscious of it or not, if my whole life I have never had a person of color in front of me as an authority figure, and nothing in my history or my socialization would affirm the knowledge of people of color, then it's going to play out in how I hear Professors of color get dismissed as too focused on race, right? I never get that, right? Right. Being presented with information about other racial groups through, for example, movies in which people of color drive the action but are not in stereotypical roles, or multicultural education, which is a challenge to white centrality. I think that's the last one I have, yeah. So these are things that trigger our defensiveness, right? That throws us off balance because this stuff rarely ever happens. We have not had to build our capacity to bear witness to the pain of racism. So then we also get into your tone, right? You need to tell me in a polite, calm way. Right? All of these rules that we put on people of color to manage and control having to engage with a challenge to our racial worldviews. So this is not, oh, there we go. I'm going to hold these questions for the end. So then what happens? Let me just pause here and see if people have questions. So this is what I call white fragility. All this stuff sets us up to have these patterns. And they manifest in behaviors that block the challenge or punish the person giving us the challenge. Is that clear? Do people have questions about it? Okay, and then where's Felix? Oh, how am I doing on time?
Good. We have 4:07. Plenty of time.
All right. So, what does it often look like? Well, I think about this in two ways. So, whites receiving feedback on our inevitable, right? It is inevitable that I have racist perspectives and behaviors, right? And I cannot tell you how liberating it is to just own that. It isn't possible not to. I tried really hard in my last time I was here to show you how I got those, how we all get those, right? So it's inevitable, right? And it's often not aware. Sometimes it is aware, but often it's not aware, right? So if you think about it as inevitable and often unaware, that's a huge help with the defensiveness, right? But when we do receive feedback from the dominant frame, a frame that's individualism and the good-bad binary, you see some really common emotions and behaviors. Right? So let me know if any of this is familiar to you. So you feel singled out, attacked, silenced, shamed, accused, insulted, judged, angry, scared, outraged. Has anyone ever seen a white person respond this way? Okay, right. All right. And so what kind of behaviors do you see? Well, you see crying, right? You see leaving. Fine, I'm leaving. I can't tell you how many times I get a call from an organization that says, we need you to come in, but 10 years ago, the People's Institute was here, and we're still traumatized from that. I'm like, wow, right, 10 years ago, we're still traumatized by a presentation, right? White fragility, I would call that. Withdrawing, forget it, right? Silence, arguing, denying, focusing on intention, seeking absolution, avoiding, fine, and then suddenly I just never really hang out with you anymore. Explaining, let me just explain to you. An insistence on misunderstanding, right? So if you have these feelings and these behaviors, and it sounds like they're familiar to everybody, and I hope if you're white in the audience, you're willing to also look at them in yourself. Odds are very high there was a time you had those feelings and those behaviors, right? None of us are outside of it, including me. So we make these claims to support those feelings and those behaviors, right? So I know people of color. I marched in the 60s. I'm actually wondering if there were any white people who didn't march in the 60s. I mean, it just seems like everybody marched in the 60s. It's incredible. But also, I guess you walked beside people of color in the 60s, so you get a certificate that never has to be renewed. 50 years that thing has lasted. And you are good to go. No new tests or anything. There's been no nuanced change, no new information you need to have. Just you marched in the 60s. Okay. I took this in college. The real oppression is class. The real oppression is class. I have no trouble when that one comes up because I grew up poor. And I mean homelessness, foster care, deep, shameful poverty. And I always knew I was white. Okay, we don't have less racism than middle-class white people. I just learned it from a different social location, right? The messages were different. I was closer to people of color because I was urban and poor, but upward mobility took me away, right? So you can't separate those out. You don't know me. You're generalizing, right? That's just your opinion. How dare you assume I would be racist? You're playing the race card. This is not welcoming to me. If I say the wrong thing, I'll get fired. If I just say the wrong thing, I'll get fired. And I do like to say, if white people got fired for one little racist thing they said, people of color would have access to all the jobs they've ever wanted. Because sometimes I wonder what it takes to get somebody fired over racism, right? You're making me feel guilty. It was just a little innocent thing. Some people find offense. I mean, I got a lot on these because I want to hit them all, okay? So bear with me. You hurt my feelings. You misunderstood me. I don't feel safe. You ever hear that one? Okay. So my question is, what does safety mean from a position of social, historical, cultural, and institutional power and privilege? No, you don't feel comfortable. You're perfectly safe. I've been doing this for 20 years. No one has ever hit anybody in any workshop I've been in. So but notice how safe is a very sacred narrative. When you invoke safety, then there's kind of a sympathy. But if I were to say I don't feel comfortable and you need me to make me feel comfortable, that has a little less social legitimacy, right? Okay. The problem is your tone. That's the problem. So I like to say to that one, what are the rules for how people of color should give us feedback about racism? Where do we get them? And how do they function? Who do they serve, right? So I'm actually working on a piece right now on trust because I do a lot of like affinity groups. Do you know what affinity groups are? And often, where you just come by the same race groups. And there's a lot of energy about we've got to build trust. And I would actually challenge that. I've tried really hard to get at the root of what do you mean when a white group has to have trust before they can talk to each other about racism. And I think what really it means is I need to trust that you won't think I'm racist before we can look at racism. And I would just say the jig is up. I think you're racist, okay? It's just like me, right? So that's off the table. I need to trust. Here's all I need to trust from my facilitator of a white affinity group. I need to trust you have a kick-ass analysis of racism and you'll hold me accountable. That's what I want. And I don't care how you do it. If you point your finger at me and self-righteously shout out, oh, that's your racism, it'd probably be easier for me to hear if you didn't do it like that. But that's on you for being a pompous, self-righteous asshole, right? Are you making a good point, right? Did you just point out something I needed to see, regardless of how you did it? So it's just a really different way to think about all this, I think. So the underlying beliefs that prop up these kinds of reactions and these kinds of claims are this idea that racism is simply personal prejudice, that as a white person, I will be the judge of whether racism has occurred, right? My learning is finished. I know all I need to know. Racism can only be intentional. If I don't intend it, it's canceled out. We don't need to talk about it anymore. In fact, you need to stop bringing it up. Whoever's laughing is encouraging me here, so I might get a little too loose up here if you keep laughing. All right. White people who experience another form of oppression or have suffered cannot have racial privilege. Right, okay, in case you came in late, these are the underlying beliefs that prop up a problematic understanding of racism, right? And that what make it so hard to, actually change the water, right? So we seek more diversity often, and we get people of color in our spaces, but we don't change these ideologies, and so people often don't feel supported, right? This is all what I would call unexamined whiteness. We have to examine and challenge the whiteness of our environments along with bringing in people of color. And, if I'm a good person, I can't be racist. My unexamined perspective is equal to people of colors. I'm entitled to remain comfortable. As a white person, I know the best way to challenge racism. This process needs to be comfortable or it's being done wrong. Race privilege is something one is aware of and can feel, and since I can't feel mine, I don't have any. Racism is conscious bias. I don't have any of that. If you knew me or understood me, you'd know I couldn't be racist. If I can't see it, it isn't legitimate. If I have friends of color, I can't be racist. Let me, did I ask you last time about gender? How many of you are in cis opposite sex relationships? Anybody? Okay. So as soon as you all fell in love with your partner, all gender tensions and dynamics disappeared, right? No more gender issues. Nothing, yeah. My point is, yes, having friends of color that you can talk to about racism with, right, is really, really important, but that doesn't mean there won't be racial dynamics between you, right, because we've been socialized in this water, right? It'll come up, it'll come out, there'll be unaware assumptions, biases. Racism is a simple problem, and the answer begins with some variation of people just need to, and it doesn't really matter what comes next, right? My worldview is objective and yours isn't. And let's see, do I have any more? No. So how does all that function? Well, you tell me, how does that function? Well, it certainly maintains white solidarity. It closes off self-reflection. It minimizes, silences the discussion, makes white people the victims, protects our limited worldview, takes race off the table, protects white privilege, focuses on the messenger, not the message, rallies more resources to white people. I'm always amazed in the workplace how when white people screw up around race, we just invest tons of resources into training them more. Think about that. Think about if people of color screw up in the workplace, are we going to invest tons of resources into training, right? So essentially, it protects racism, right? So maybe just to get a little interaction, because I'm going to give you the antidote to this on the other side. How about you turn to the person next to you and just share a moment of either your own white fragility, if you're white, or if you're a person of color, just an example of something you've observed. Okay, I'm going to draw you back. I'll be honest with you that, it gets frustrating to see this white fragility all the time, right? And in my line of work, because I, day in and day out, am engaged in racial conversations, I see it a lot. And there's a part of me that just wants to speak back to the nonsense, right? And there's a little bit of a cathartic pleasure in it, I will be honest. But I also worry about being condescending or being shaming or whatever, right? Because I think if you're white, you've fallen into this. How could you not fall into this, right? I fall into this. I have fallen into this. So I want to make space for you to look at it and be able to own it and to know that it's like an up and down thing, right? It's not like you're here and then you're here and you're never back here again, right? It's a process. I'm constantly getting feedback on my unaware racism, and I certainly have much less feelings come up than I used to have, but I still have feelings come up. So I'm kind of trying to balance a little bit of sass with also making space for people to be willing to look at this stuff. But my sense is that everybody had an example, right? Did everybody have an example? Okay, so it is ubiquitous, and it makes it so hard to move forward, right? And so I'm hoping that I'm giving you some language. I actually have a handout that, if you go to my website, it's just robindiangelo.com. There's a tab called Resources, and it has a handout on this. I think it's called Racism Above and Below. And in your departments or your groups or whatever, if you have that, and some white fragility comes up, you're able to say, yeah, I know, I hear you, I know that's hard, but that sounds like this right here. So how could we think about that differently, right? So it gives you a shared framework, right? And helps you guide people when they get stuck. All right. So let's look at what this could be like if we had an anti-racist framework, right? You know, I think I've made it clear that all those reactions come from the way we're taught to think about what racism is, and the way that we're taught to think about it from a dominant frame protects it, right? So when we have an anti-racist frame, which again, we understand that it's inevitable, that we've all been socialized into it. And when I say that, I mean, actually, we've all been socialized into racism, but from different positions. So I would say all white people have been socialized into racial superiority, and people of color have to constantly push against the messages of inferiority, right? So there's different impacts into about the socialization. So the feelings are gratitude. I mean, when you understand that it's inevitable, you actually feel grateful that somebody was willing to help you see something, right? You get to where you eagerly want to know what your blind spots are. And I want to be careful here, because while we do want to be grateful when we're given feedback, we cannot depend completely on other people giving us feedback and kind of fall into that, hey, if nobody said I did anything problematic, I must not be doing anything problematic. Because it takes a huge emotional toll and risk to give white people feedback on racism, because it often doesn't go well. So let me just ask this question of the folks of color in the room. How often have you given us feedback on our inevitable and often unaware racism, and had that go well for you? Okay, see the smiles over there? Right, rarely, right? Yes. Okay, and I recently asked a group, so what would it be like if you could simply give us feedback, have us graciously receive it, reflect on it, and strive to change the behavior? What would that be like? Less stress, yeah? Pardon? Unusual. Yeah, I actually recently had a man of color in one of my groups, and he said it would be revolutionary. And just sit with that a minute. Revolutionary. That we would graciously receive, reflect, and seek to change the behavior. On the one hand, that's how difficult we are. And on the other, that's how easy this is. And I think we are talking years on people's lives, right? We do know that people of color don't live as long. And heart disease and blood pressure and diabetes and all of these ills that come from stress. And this is part of it, right? It's incredibly stressful. So when someone takes that risk with you, because usually what happens is they get penalized. Whether we mean it or not, I believe that all that stuff on the other slide functions as a form of bullying. I'm going to make it so miserable for you, you're just not going to do that again. It's not conscious, but that is how it functions. So when someone takes a risk and gives us feedback, they've probably seen something in there that tells them they could try. Because I'll ask another question. How often, for the folks of color, how often you just not bother? Just not bother, right? That's right. And that doesn't mean everything's fine. Okay, you're all seeing that? Okay. So gratitude, excitement, yeah. Don't you want to see this? Right? I want to know, right? I get to root out another piece of it. Discomfort, yeah. I'm uncomfortable. Yes, I do feel guilt. Now, luckily for me, I was raised Catholic. Guilt motivates me. But yeah, there's some guilt in there. But again, how is it functioning? Is it functioning to motivate you, or is it functioning to excuse inaction, right? Yes, I feel embarrassed. I do feel motivated. I feel humility. I feel compassion. All those other emotions on the other side block all of that, right? I'm interested. I want to know. I want to understand. I care. I want to stay engaged. I don't want to disengage, right? And so when you have those feelings, you get a different set of behaviors, right? You get reflection, apology. I can't tell you how many cross-racial tensions could just have been done if someone apologized. I'm sorry. Thanks for letting me know. I can see that now. I'm sorry. Listening, we listen, right? Processing, right? Sometimes, mostly, I try to catch myself, and sometimes I'm given feedback, and sometimes I immediately get it and see it, and sometimes I actually don't, and I need to kind of think about it. Or I once got some feedback that was so intense for me, actually, that I stopped being able to think very well, and I needed to really take about a week to work through it. But you got to go back in and come back and say, okay, I processed, here's where I'm at. Oftentimes we'll say I need to process, but it will function as a way to disengage and not to come back. Do you know what I'm talking about? So, and generally, I will let somebody know, here's what I understand that happened in that. Sometimes all you can do is say, I'm sorry, and that's good enough, right? But for a deeper level, actually say, here's what I learned from that feedback you gave me. And that actually kind of affirms the risk that the person took and the gift, if you will, that they gave you. If you map out, here's what I learned from that. And then it's good to add, did I miss anything? I recently got some feedback about some ways that I had really offended the intelligence of a young black woman. And as we were repairing it, I asked her at the end, is there anything more you need to hear from me or that needs to happen here for us to move forward? And she said, well, the next time you do it, and I had to smile. I love that she just said the next time you do it, rather than if you do it. It's like, of course you're going to do it again. So the next time you do it, would you like your feedback publicly or privately? And I said, publicly, please. Because given my kind of position, as someone who speaks on these issues, I think it's really critical that other white people see that no one's outside of this and no one's free of this. And then that gives me an opportunity to model a response, right? I personally don't feel like it had to be done privately. If it's a public transgression, it's okay to reconcile it publicly. But even the wanting to get it privately kind of indicates a sense of somehow seeing this as an aberration, or somehow it's something shameful rather than inevitable, and that everyone could learn from it, right? You seek to understand, you grapple, you believe, just believe, right? Even sometimes without having to understand. So what are the claims we make when we have an anti-racist frame? The claims that support those feelings and those behaviors? Well, thank you. Yes, yes, yes. I'm opening, I'm shifting. It's my responsibility to resist defensiveness and complacency. It's not on you to tell it to me in a way that doesn't trigger my defensiveness, right? Whew, this is hard, but so stimulating and important. Nothing's wrong here. It being hard and uncomfortable is not a signifier that something's wrong or off, aside from racism. It's personal, but not strictly personal. I try to remember that too. It's about me. Yep, I did that thing. And it's not really about me. This is about this whole thing. And your reaction to me is also about this whole thing. And I think in some ways, the more emotion people of color show, the more they trust that they can show that. Right? There's no right way to do this. I'm going to focus on the message, not the messenger. I need to build my capacity to bear witness and to endure the discomfort and the pain of racism, right? That's on me. Bring it on. I can handle it. I got some work to do, and I will for the rest of my life. But nothing is more fulfilling than aligning what you profess with what you practice. So the underlying beliefs that would enable those kinds of responses are, that, and actually let's do this, just to kind of get a little engagement. So I'm going to go around the room, and if you're white, read one of these off, okay? We'll start with Dr. Bridges. You get to read the first one. Yeah.
Being good or bad is not relevant.
Racism is a multi-layered system and can't be avoided. Whites have blind spots on racism. I have blind spots. Racism is complex. I don't have to understand it for it to be valid.
White comfort maintains the racial status quo. Discomfort is necessary and important.
I must not confuse comfort with safety. I am safe in discussions of racism.
The antidote to guilt is action.
I bring my group's history with me. History matters.
White.
Oh, we can go that way.
Unconsciously invested in racism. I am unconsciously invested in racism.
Bias is implicit, unconscious. I don't expect to be aware of why without a lot of ongoing effort.
Can you just imagine if white folks had this frame of reference? How much things would shift? Yeah. Okay.
Feedback from people of color indicates trust.
We're going with white folks.
Feedback on why racism is difficult to give. How I receive feedback is not as relevant as the feedback itself.
It takes courage to lead other whites in this work. How can I support those that do? Given socialization, it is more likely that I am the one who doesn't understand the issue.
Racism hurts even kills people of color 24/7. Interrupting is more important than my family's ego or self.
Thank you. And so how does that function? Well, it minimizes defensiveness, it demonstrates vulnerability, it demonstrates curiosity and humility, it allows for growth, it stretches your worldview, it ensures action, and it puts what one professes into practice, builds authentic relationships and trust, interrupts privilege protecting comfort, interrupts internalized superiority, interrupts racism. So how might whites begin or continue? Well, be willing to tolerate the discomfort associated with an honest appraisal and discussion of your internalized superiority and racial privilege. Begin to challenge your own racial reality. Acknowledge yourself as a racial being with a particular and limited perspective on race. Begin to understand people of color's realities through authentic interaction rather than through the media or through unequal relationships. And take action to address internalized racism, the racism of other whites, and our institutions. Get educated and act. So I thank you very much.